Hello?
Hey, Rich, it's Larson. You got a minute?
Sure, Larson, what's up?
Hello and welcome to the Got a Minute podcast. My name is Larson Hicks. Thanks for joining us. I'm joined by my co-host here, Pastor Rich Lusk. How you doing today, Rich?
Yeah, great to be with you, Larson.
Yeah, man. I'm reporting here from sunny Monroe, Louisiana, where it's like 115 degrees. I think it's not really suitable for human life. But I'm hiding out in a friend's Airbnb with some air conditioning, so I'm safe.
That's great. Well, it's good to be with you, and we got a great topic on to discuss today for sure.
Yeah. Well, So this is a podcast we've been looking forward to. We're joined today by Ron Dodson out of Texas, and Ron's an old friend of Rich's and is in the Biblical Horizons kind of Theopolis world orbit. But you've got a lot going on, Ron. Why don't you introduce yourself to us and to our listeners?
Well, I really appreciate you guys having me on. I am an evil hedge fund manager.
Oh,
so cue scary music in in the statistical vol arb space. So not only evil, but also incredibly boring.
Okay,
a lot of math, but it's given me a lot of time to read. I taught myself, although I'm very rusty now, I taught myself Koine back in the day. Got really hooked in to Jim Jordan and that, like you said, that orbit. I think I taught a Sunday school class at my church here in Dallas, Park Cities Presbyterian, and Doug Jordan ended up showing up. I remember one day I'm talking about something Jim said, and this tall guy comes up to me and says, "I don't know about, who's this Jim Jordan guy?" And I go, "Well, we all read different things and everything." And he goes, "I'm just kidding. He's my dad." So that was kind of a crazy. And what's interesting in that same class, if you know who John Walvoord is, who wrote the Walvoord and Zuck dispensational view of eschatology, that textbook, John Walvoord Jr. was a front row guy in that Sunday school class. So pretty eclectic group. It was fun.
Wow. Yeah, Ron, I don't even remember when you and I first crossed paths when we first met. I think it was even when I lived in Texas. So it would have been a long ways back, or maybe when I lived in Monroe, but it's been a while, I know. But obviously we've been in some similar circles with Biblical Horizons and that kind of thing, and probably have a lot of the same appreciation for Jim and what's come out of that. So what we want to talk about today, and I expect this will be a very wide-ranging conversation. We'll probably touch on a lot of different things. But one question that there's a lot of different ways to frame this, but one way that it's come up recently is obviously there's something deeply wrong with our society. Our culture is showing all kinds of signs of sickness. And one question that's come up is there a political solution to this? And some people will say no, and maybe they'll move in sort of a pietistic direction. We just need to do more evangelism. Other people will say yes, there's a political solution, or at least there's partially a political solution. That's got to be part of the answer. Other people maybe take another pathway, want to take another way forward that maybe includes the political, but is focused more on the church. All different kinds of ways of dealing with what we see going around us in our culture today. You also have questions being asked like, is the Constitution dead? And you have some people who say, no, what we really need is to repristinate classical liberalism and the original constitutional order. That's what we need to aim for. There are other people who say, hey, if the Constitution was only made for a virtuous and religious people, and we're no longer virtuous and religious in the sense that they meant, certainly, then that means the Constitution is dead, and we can't be looking to it for solutions. Of course, all of this, you have to, however you answer those questions, you still have to ask the question, okay, so what do we do? What do we do about all of this? And that's why we brought Ron in. We think that Ron is got a lot of insights about all of these kinds of things and so much more. So Ron, why don't you talk a little bit about where you think we are culturally and politically, and how you think we ought to assess the situation, and then we'll get into the way forward.
Well, there's an awful lot there. I think we've lost I think James Burnham had some really good insights when he wrote The Managerialist Revolution that that we really aren't in we'd seen in the early part of the 20th century, we'd seen the communist, the Marxism, the Bolshevism, and to a lesser extent Trotskyite movements, and we saw a fascist response to that, which was really in its core an anti-communist response or reaction. And the U.S. and the British Empire is a mercantilist state, and the U.S. as a capitalist state trying to this was before the U.S. took over everything. And the question was, what was the future? And Burnham said that it was none of those things. It was this new rising managerialism. And then Sam Francis later wrote a kind of a furthering of Burnham's thought called Leviathan and Its Enemies, which is a incredibly difficult read, but it has some good insights. So I think the system that we're in is this managerialist deal, and all that is a Byzantine pragmatism, and Byzantine in that it's multi-layered. Experts run everything, a kind of a new priesthood.
Too. Yeah.
I'm sorry?
Bureaucracy.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
Class. Yeah.
But it's not born, it's telos. Its goal isn't virtue or value or heaven or Christendom. It's purely pragmatic. How do we make the arrow go up?
Efficiency.
And yeah, efficiency, pragmatism. So this Byzantine pragmatism is what rules us. And, everybody's, and to a certain degree, rightly so, wondering what the next election is going to hold. But really, the president has very, very little power as it currently stands. But you asked about culture. Where are we culturally? Well, the Pew stuff looks bad, doesn't it? From a Christian standpoint, we seem to be church attendance is down, marriage is down. I think the biggest statistic, if you want to look at these things in a very concrete way, fertility is down. Well, we're below. Christians are below replacement. Even evangelical Christians are far below replacement. That speaks to a lack of faith to me. And so I think, and then whereas used to there was if you take, I don't know if y'all are familiar with Aaron Renn. Aaron wrote on the kind of the tripartite epochs of American history with regards to Christianity, and there was the old positive world and the neutral world. I think he's right that we're definitely in the negative world, but to put a finer point on it, the positive world really was a monoculture for a lot of reasons, and not just Christian. We had if you want to think about the way Marshall McLuhan thought of things, the media is the message, or that kind of deal. We had three main networks, and we really had a monoculture, for bad or for good or ill. And we don't have that now. We have a very everything is look, we're on a podcast where
right.
And I'm on some other podcasts, and this is great to get words out. But most podcasts, unless you're one of the real biggies, man, you get 5,000-6,000 views. That's pretty good. Whereas we live in a country of 340 million people. So we have a very atomized culture.
Yeah.
We have I would say a negative view in what's left of the monoculture towards Christianity, or at least a difficult and uphill battle to where Jesus really isn't considered part of the public square.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of where that's a very long answer, Rich. I'm sorry.
No, that's great.
No, that's perfect.
But that's kind of where I see us.
Yeah, and the monoculture now has, the moniker Christian nationalism or white Christian nationalism, has become sort of the mainstream media's shorthand just to speak now of all Christianity. They've come up with a
Certainly.
label, that sounds scary and negative, but they're really just talking about Christians, it seems. So
I would agree with that. I think I think Christianity is the last main bulwark against what many call the global American empire, which really isn't about Americanism. It's more about being freed from any unchosen bonds. It's not liberty. It's a licentiousness maximized kind of thing. I call it. I tend to call biblical liberty as baseball liberty, and that means you got to play within the foul lines. There is no
yeah,
complete and utter freedom. Doesn't give you a baseball game. It gives you people with bats angry at each other. But once you put bases and two foul lines out, suddenly you can get a game and you can move forward and accomplish things. So anyway, that's kind of my thought on that.
Yeah, I like your analogy there. So Ron, obviously there's a lot of, a lot of these discussions take place on social media or, there's certain websites dedicated to articles discussing these kind of things. When we ask the question, we are Christians living in America. We've got a particular cultural heritage that we belong to. We think that the church is incredibly important to God's purposes in history. We want to see what we might call a renewed Christendom, a Christian civilization, which is not that's not a civilization where every individual is personally a Christian, but it is a
No.
civilization where the norms and the standards and the expectations, the way of life are all shaped by Scripture.
Yes.
And very much rooted in not only what God's revealed in the natural order, but rooted in what God's revealed in Scripture. If that's where we want to go, and I think all three of us share a very, I think, optimistic eschatology, a postmillennial outlook on the future, but we also know that doesn't mean
Absolutely.
anything's going to, things might get far worse before they get better, and it
It's
could be a
not a
long
straight
time
line.
to see them get better.
yeah.
Exactly, it's not a straight line. It could take a long time too. But what do we do? I mean, where we find ourselves, what do we do? How significant is, say, Christian political involvement in trying to bring about change? Is that even possible? So, for example, when you look at the candidates we have, I think you can make a really strong case that Trump is better than Biden, but neither one is anything like what we might want in terms of the big picture.
No.
You could say, well, then let's focus more on the local level. But even there are all kinds of limitations that we run into. That I think there's a lot to be said for that, but it doesn't seem to be a cure-all. What do you see as sort of a way forward?
Well, I don't think are any cure-alls in the a huge problem in American culture is high time preference. Jordan Peterson is by no means a Christian of any sort, I don't think, although I think he has an appreciation. But he had an incredible insight in his Genesis lectures when he said, the God of the Bible is the God of low time preference. And I think that's exactly right. And we thwart or attempt to thwart, maybe unknowingly, the long term colonization project of the church and the kingdom when we emphasize we have such a high time preference. So I love what you said. I am very optimistic in my eschatology, but I call it post mill 40K. I would, God promised to 1,000 generations. Well, that would be about 40,000 years.
Right.
I guess we're, depending on your counting from that, we're 2 or 3 in. So we've got a lot of time. And I think we need to, and patience, low time preference is the fruit of the Spirit. That's kind of the culmination of a godly character. So I think we really do need to exhibit that. On the other hand, I think we need to know, as a lot of these online dissident right guys say, we need to know what time it is. And clown shows produce really bad results because the reactions get so awful and bloody. Because eventually, if it goes on long enough, somebody will come along and say, hey, look, I'll take care of this. Well, how? You don't need to worry about how. I'm just going to take care of this. And eventually, Joe Sixpack says, okay, somebody just please make it to where I can walk down the street and not worry, when I can have low frictional costs to living. But that's otherwise known as peace, as Luther might call it. So the Weimar didn't necessitate National Socialism, and especially the final solution version of National Socialism, but it sure played a part in leading to it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So we just need to be, as Christians, we need to be that prophetic voice that is willing to whisper in the ear of the king or shout on the not just at the ballot box, but be bold about what is good and right. We have the tree of the knowledge of good and evil in the Spirit and in the Bible.
Yeah.
And so that is wisdom. That is wisdom, and we need to be willing to impart that prophetically to the culture at large. How that works out in detail, there's a lot of. I love the conversation, and the kind of new right on the Christian side needs to be a conversation, and a lot of times I see it as just throwing insults at each other, and I wish that would stop.
Yeah, that's a good word.
Yeah.
Well,
So go ahead, Larson.
Yeah, well, I was going to say just on the low time preference comment, I love that, and I love.
Oh, you've dropped out.
What I find is a lot of political dissidents on the right.
For me too.
Oh, can you guys hear me? Sorry.
Yeah,
am I
repeat
back?
what you just said, because we lost you for a second.
Okay, sorry about that. Hopefully this will be stable. What I was going to say is what I'm seeing among the kind of dissident right currently is these very, very impatient postmillennialists. Guys who are full red pill post mill, cage stage post mill, but who have ironically no patience about the future. And what I feel like Doug Wilson has been saying for several years now is he's been trying to warn these guys to not take the bait.
Doug's been great. Doug's been great on this.
Yeah, there's this. We're in this negative world. This what's left of the monoculture media has been just laying out this racism bait for a good decade now, trying to get some idiots on the right to take it, and these post mill guys who have no patience have finally taken it, and now all of a sudden these accusations of racism are landing because these guys are going, fine, you guys are being racist, you guys are anti-white, which is true. There's white racism is a huge problem in modern America, but these guys are going, we're going to fight fire with fire. We can be just as racist too, and I think they're falling right into the trap that's been laid out for them.
I don't even know if it's a trap. It's just a fruit of immaturity, of understanding the right categories. I mean, clearly God, it seems at Babel, scattered the people and created all different, maybe it was earlier than that.
Sure.
But there's all different kinds of people. Where I really draw a hard line is at any kind of white identitarianism that is seen as supremacist. Because if you want to go full, I mean, part of the issue is now, for the first time in history, the collective knowledge of the world is at anyone's fingertips.
Right.
And that should be good. And ultimately, I think it is. But the tree of the story of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil with Adam and Eve is that wisdom is needed, maturity is needed to handle certain truths. Are there normal distributions of different people groups on all kinds of different spectrum? Yes, there are. how do you handle that as a Christian? Number one, and that's with love and the recognition that everyone is created in God's image and is of equal worth and reflected glory. Baseline, that cannot be validated, or you're really traveling into a blasphemy heresy kind of deal that God has shown throughout history to judge rather harshly. And then, but second of all, any idea of white supremacy is foolish on its face, because those very same all the genetic and all the IQ and all those spectral scaling studies have shown that whites, which the three of us are as a group right smack in the middle. So it's, I don't get that. I never have gotten that. I'm okay with being of facing scientific facts, of not putting my head in the sand. But
Yeah.
it should lead, if Christendom was traditionally a Northern European or a European continent thing, if that's where it sprang from, because that's where the gospel had fruit,
Yeah.
great. But it's not born of any type of, just like the Jews were a peculiar, humble people, and God chose them to administrate the locus of his presence, even though Noahic Covenant belief was all over, it seems. But they were a peculiar, humble people, or should have been. White Northern Europeans should be similarly humble. If we are the ones who God used, in theory, I'm not saying that's the case, but if this is the premise that you deal with online, then we should be humble as well. We should be especially humble. And I find the inability to deal with those two realities frustrating, because it puts up all kinds of roadblocks to moving forward. People rightly say, well, look, if you just think, it's like the argument against Calvinism, because people wrongly think that Calvinism is a way, we're chosen, we're special, whereas really we're chosen, we're humble.
Right.
And I got to work out my salvation with fear and trembling. So that frustrates me to no great end. But we need to have good strategies in combating it in a loving way, so that these people who are immature can be brought into the fold of wisdom and godly love, without giving up, without just putting our heads in the sand at the same time. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, that's good. So
so.
there's so many different things here. So that raises a question. So for example, anti-white racism is a well-established fact of modern American life. So
Jeremy Carl just wrote a great book on
Jeremy
it.
Carl
I highly
wrote a great
recommend
book
it.
about it. And we you see this kind of crop up in the news day after day, like Disney saying we're going to hire somebody and it's not going to be a white person, okay?
Right.
And not going to be a white male, certainly.
Don't go watch The Acolyte, by the way.
Don't worry, no danger there.
Wow.
So the response to that, I mean, I remember years ago. This was at least 20 years ago. I remember Tim Keller making a remark. He said, the problem with white people in America, you're a majoritarian people group, and you do not realize you have a culture. You think that your way of doing things is just the way they're done, and then everybody else has a culture. So the white way, like if you're a majoritarian culture in a nation, your own culture is invisible to you. You don't see it. You can see everybody else's culture.
It's the David Foster Wallace water.
Right, exactly. So you don't realize that you have a culture too. But I remember hearing him say that and thinking to myself, that sounds like it could be kind of dangerous, to tell white people that they've got a culture, and because what you can end up doing is then white people can say, well, we're going to act as an identitarian group, just like these other groups do. And then what is that going to produce? And in a way, I think that's exactly what we're seeing happen is anti-white racism has risen to the point where now you've got a lot of whites who want to fight back against it. And it's like they want to fight fire with fire. They want to fight racism with racism. And I'm not saying I mean, Jeremy Curl's book, I think, is excellent precisely because it's not that way. When I first
Right.
saw somebody was writing a book on anti-white racism, I thought, oh no,
Oh no.
what
Yeah.
is this going to do? But then as I listened to him and got into the book some, I realized, oh no, this is exactly what we need because it's a very dispassionate discussion of the
Right.
facts on the ground. And then a lot of his solutions are things that they're very doable. Like basically, he would say if Disney is announcing that they're going to hire somebody for a position and they're not going to hire a white person, that's actually illegal. According to civil rights legislation, you're not allowed to discriminate in that kind of way. It's actually illegal. So why doesn't somebody take them to court and fight it according to the laws we have on the books? Now, maybe the laws we have on the books won't be enforced. That's certainly the case, say, with something like immigration.
Well, and I think
laws, they're not being enforced. But that's a way of pushing back against it.
Sure.
Well, you were going to say something, Ron. I'll let you jump in here.
No, I was just going to say the selective enforcement is, again, going back to Curtis Yarvin. Yarvin talks about formal versus informal power or formalism, and we've abandoned formalism for an informal power structure, and power is leaked from the official power to not official. So what actually holds the power, and that leads to selective enforcement, friends rewarding friends, all these kind of things. By the way, friends rewarding friends in and of itself sounds distasteful to our ears, but let's say we were in a Christendom impact, then we have the friendly view of all citizens, and so that you can deal with that way. But this abandonment of formalism, and this gets into the whole idea what you mentioned in the open about is constitutionalism dead? The ideas that were present in the founding documents are where they reflect biblical truth are eternal. The issue is that they are not formally their formal power has leaked into informal power structures to where there is it's like it's like the guys on Marine One saluting Biden who may or may not know that they're even there, and so it's an issue not of whether something is compelling and true, it's whether or not it has the force of law in actuality, and that's a real issue that gets into Harry Jaffa, who might have been the most arrogant historian philosopher who ever lived, but he was brilliant. Wrote a lot on Strauss, and his view of the Jewish guy, not coming from a Christian standpoint, but coming from an American originalist standpoint, said that the founding of America was as perfect from a philosophical and transcendent sense as you can possibly get, for as long as you keep it. For all these structures have life cycles because they have second and third order effects. Because they bring prosperity, they have second and third order effects on the citizenry themselves. So it's impossible for a man-made structure to be eternal. Now, that's pretty compelling. As much as Jaffa makes me want to pull my hair out, and at my age, that's dangerous. I think he's exactly right there. Michael Anton, another writer from that school, Claremont, West Coast Straussianism for all you political philosophy guys, wrote on this very cogently. I can send it to you guys. You can put it in the show notes if you like. This very idea. And so I think part of what we're dealing with is the life cycle of any social structure. It doesn't mean the Constitution is bad. It just might mean that it for this particular group of people run its course. Mm-hmm. I know that's going to sound awful to a lot of folks, but
Well, go
That's
back to what I said at the beginning. John Adams' line that the Constitution is made for a virtuous and religious people, and by religious, obviously they meant Christian. They were not
that's
pluralist.
right. That's right.
So it's made for a Christian people, and it will not function as it should for any other. So the problem would not be with the Constitution as such, though I do think there are things about the Constitution you could criticize. I don't think it's
Yes,
beyond criticism. It's not an infallible document.
especially in the later amendments.
Well, sure, that and that too. But the problem here is with the people. And the problem is that in our, you might say in our prosperity, we have forgotten God. In our prosperity, we have turned away from God. And now we're seeing a kind of Romans 1, it's like the second half of Romans 1 is unfolding before our eyes. You turn away from God, and that means, when you lose touch with God, you lose touch with reality. And that's what
That's
we're
right.
seeing happen in our society. And as Jim Jordan, somebody that I know we appreciate, Jim would say that when man turns away from God, he goes insane. And that's
Yes.
what we're seeing. We've got a culture now where half the people don't know what a man is or don't know what a woman is. They don't think that you can determine someone's sex at birth. So that's now where we are, and that's the fruit of rejecting God and rejecting His truth. You really do lose touch with reality.
Yeah.
So I want to come back to the race piece for just a minute, because for years when people would accuse the right of being racist, I'd be like, no, that's ridiculous. I mean, conservatives are not racist. That's what you call somebody when you don't have an argument. You latch onto the racist label and you try to use that to make people feel guilty and shame them into at least being silent and not changing their views. But in the
Right.
last few years, I do think we've seen at least flirtations with racism on the right of certain sorts. One is, there's been and I don't know how widespread any of these things are, but there's been, hints of anti-Semitism here and there, and you'll hear people talk about, well, the Jews are disproportionately influential in DC and in Hollywood, and they run the pornography industry, and they're involved in all these really evil things that are wrecking our society.
Yes.
Or you'll hear talk
And
about
all those things are true, though.
well, they're true, but this would be my question. This would be my whenever that point is made. This is what I say. What do you want me to do with that information?
Right.
How am I
Exactly.
supposed to act? Like, are you
That's
saying
right.
that the world would be a better place if Hitler had killed more Jews? Like, is that what
No.
or what if we identified these people instead of by their ethnicity as Jews, by their ideology as progressives? Do we lose anything?
Well, yeah, the problem is we're dealing with people on the ground, and just as the term Christian was not an internal term, it was an external term applied to one who was baptized and walking in a church. The Bible uses the term 3 times, and it's always used by somebody from the outside. These are out-group monikers, and so you have to be somewhat realistic in the sense that is that unbelief and really the problems that you speak of that Jewish folks do have an outsized influence if you're just going demographically. If 11 of the 14, 16 cabinet members were let's pick something, Chinese, for instance, and
Right.
all had names like Zhang and Yao and so on and so forth. And that showed up on the first day of Trump's, let's say Trump wins the next election and he picks his cabinet and they're all standing up there. People would side eye that, right? And so but the answer isn't ever that you kill people. The question should be why is that, number one, and how can they not be on our side?
Right.
I mean, we're speaking specifically of Ashkenazi Jews who outscore everyone but the Han Chinese on all these metrics. Super high performing IQ, our artistic ability, all these things. Unbelievable people. They should be absolutely, as Christians, as Christians who have a true kingdom, we should absolutely be saying, Why aren't they on our side? Let's go.
Right.
Let's go get those guys.
Yeah.
How
So
great would it be if they were with
yeah.
us?
That's really my question. If the Jews are a high performing group, which certainly seems to have been the case, then the question
Yes.
so if they're very competent, obviously those competencies can be used for good or for evil. The
That's right.
intelligence can be used for good or for evil. But that's my question: is when I hear people talk about their ethnicity, the fact that they are Jewish, what is that? What difference does that make? I mean, how is that significant in some way? Why are
It's
we
only
calling attention to that as
yeah.
opposed to just the ideology?
It's only playing a proxy for other factors,
Right.
unbelief,
Right.
a different set of cultural practices that are distinct from me. It's just other,
Right.
and so you end up getting Somalis in Detroit, for instance. They could be from Mozambique. The point is they're other in culture, in language, and all these things, and that's scary for people.
Mm-hmm.
And it creates these frictional costs of living that people just chafe against.
Mm-hmm.
It's 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 interesting that so I think the racial stuff, which is wrongheaded, is just a shorthand proxy for these other differences.
Yeah.
Because, for instance, I coach soccer on the side for the last 15 years, and my coaching partner forever is one. I mean, we're like brothers. Is this big black guy who's awesome, Charles, who is seriously like a brother to me. We could not be more different,
Mm-hmm.
uh, but 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 we are united in purpose and experience and teleology, where we want things to go, especially with our the girls that we coach in soccer. So I think that is where the answer lies, is in a unity of purpose and a unity of the tools to accomplish those purposes.
Mm-hmm.
What is that? Well, custom, language, those things, those are real. Now, to the left, that's going to always be called racialist or racist.
Mm-hmm.
But those are just the things that make a society work better.
Yeah.
When I go, it is easier to live if I have common experience and language with my neighbors or the people I deal with. Those aren't value judgments. It's just commonality.
Yeah, and these are arguments that Pat Buchanan was making, of course, back in the 80s and 90s, and nobody would really listen, and he was arguing.
Well, it's the paleocon. It's the paleocon argument that's been made since Taft.
Yes,
yeah.
Nobody would listen to him at the time, and of course, he got accused of racism, and he also got accused of standing in the way of economic progress, opposition to free markets, that kind of thing. Because why shouldn't we produce our goods in the cheapest possible place, or import lower cost labor, whatever it might be. And obviously those issues are still because nobody listened to Pat Buchanan. Those issues haven't gone away. They've just.
That's right.
But
I voted for Pat Buchanan in 1992. So
I see this play out in a lot of different ways. So I'll give you another example of this. And I've been critical of Stephen Wolf's book on Christian nationalism. There are a lot of things about that I really appreciate. I mean, in terms of the big picture, obviously there's a lot of commonality, a lot of overlap. There's some things philosophically and historically and so forth that I would take issue with, but I'm also very sympathetic with the overall project. But he's got the tweet, and I'm paraphrasing here. I don't have it in front of me, but he said something like, "The only people who can save America are white evangelical Christians."
Mm-hmm.
And my thought on that was, well, okay, I mean, yes.
Seems like an own goal, doesn't it?
Who are we trying to save America from? We're trying to save America from mostly white progressive non-Christians.
Right.
That's right.
You've kind of got white on both sides of the equation there. So why not
cancel each other out?
And I don't know. I don't know Stephen. I know friends of Stephen. So this isn't coming from any kind of special knowledge. Stephen is it comes from the scholastic, ultra systematic side of things. I think he's OPC.
Mhm.
So, and I'm more biblical, biblical horizons,
Right.
federal vision,
Uh-oh.
kind of a continental covenant, objectivity of the covenants where I'm coming from. So we just don't have a lot of commonality on the things I like to talk about, which is more biblical framing of these issues. And I think the continental Christians have a lot to say on how to frame these issues.
Mm-hmm.
That might be topic for another podcast, but you're exactly right. I think what Stephen is saying is that the heritage of Christendom is a Protestant Christendom is a Northern European thing.
Sure.
That's fair. I think calling it white is I think I understand where he's coming from, but it would be so much easier to reframe that category.
Yeah.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Ethnicity
Yes.
instead of
Yes, that's
race,
exactly what I would.
Well,
I
it's
would
a
say.
national.
Right.
There is, let's just hit the elephant in the room. Nationalism. What is it? Well, if nationalism means the state owes its first loyalty to its citizens whom it can call on to die for its purposes,
Right.
I'm all for that. I'm a nationalist. If nationalism means that the things that make life more blessed for its people, that the king, I use king in quotes here, has control over, the things that the paleocons were talking about back in the 80s and early 90s, common language, common culture, those things which are informed by Christianity, then I'm a nationalist.
Sure.
If by nationalist you mean the dehumanizing of whomever is flying my flag, in other words, this eschatological nationalism, which is what a lot of the European nationalism is, I got no time for that. That makes no sense to me, because the whole purpose in Christ is that all the nations would be blessed.
Right.
Yet the nations seem to exist in the consummation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, God has organized humanity into nations.
Into nations.
Talks about God.
That is a reality.
Yeah.
Well,
so that's kind of where I
nations,
stand on that deal.
Nations and ethnicity do not always completely align.
Right.
No, they do not.
That, especially, obviously, in the Old Covenant, perhaps more so. Although even there, you see very permeable boundaries. So even with Israel, the covenant nation, you've got people can be cast out of Israel, and Gentiles can be brought into Israel, even in the Old Covenant.
Well, Christ's own lineage, calls out several several instances of
he's
outside.
100%.
There's Gentile blood mixed in.
Right.
My first article for Amref got a lot of. Had a 5 million views or whatever. It was just what is Israel. I had no idea it was going to get that kind of response, but it makes the argument that Israel has had an ethnic scaffolding, but a covenantal reality. It was a covenantal.
That's great.
Group.
Yeah. Well, I feel like the stage, I think we've talked, I think another way to think about, just kind of bringing back some of the topics we've covered already. I feel like the stage has been set with the negative world that we're in and the anti-white racism for this. It's this kind of Girardian, sort of triangular desire, sort of because when we listed off all of those negative things that the Jews have a disproportionate influence on, we could say the same on all of the we could say the Jews have a disproportionate number of people in finance. The Jews have a disproportionate number of people in science, in the arts, in
music,
right? So I think the stage is set for white people, white Christians who are feeling oppressed or starting to feel oppressed and who have been baited into this racial conflict to see a scapegoat, to see a scapegoat sitting right there, ready to be toppled. The problem is that in America, the races that are succeeding are the most are Indians. Like from India. Disproportionate number of physicians and scholars. Asians. Asians have the highest, of Asians in America. I think it's the highest wealth, per
Well, let me
capita.
jump in here, Larson, and say something, because you're right.
Yeah.
I mean, you can look at it that way, but you can analyze things a lot of different ways. So, for example, you could also analyze prosperity in America according to family structure. And if you do that, what you find is that no matter what your ethnicity or skin color is, if you have an intact family, you do pretty well in America.
Right.
So
Well,
blacks
if you have
that
an intact family,
families tend to do really well. Whites that have broken families don't do very well.
That's right.
So there's a lot of different ways of slicing the data depending on what argument you want to make. And so I would argue that just analyzing things according to race, or even prioritizing organizing the data according to race, can be extremely misleading. So, for example,
that's taking the bait, right? I mean,
it's taking the bait.
That's taking the bait.
I would call it an unforced error.
Right.
So, here's another example of this.
I like
okay?
that.
White Boy Summer, that's so popular right now. Okay, and again, if White Boy Summer is just supposed to kind of a fun thing that people are kicking around just for laughs, I probably have no objection to it. But it does seem to be used as a kind of racial pushback against the kind of anti-white racism that Jeremy Carl has identified. Okay, right. And if that's the case, I'd want to say, if this becomes part of a political movement, you're putting a really low ceiling on how far you can take it, because doing white identity politics is never going to be a winning way forward. I mean, for guys who are really obsessed with winning, it seems to me that talking about white boy politics and sort of politicizing that is just going to put a hard cap on how far you can go, because that's just not going to appeal to wide swaths of people for all kinds of reasons. And some of those reasons may not be so good, but some of those reasons are probably pretty valid. So instead of White Boy Summer, let's say it was American Boy Summer. Okay. What changes? What's gained or lost with that?
Fun memes.
Exactly.
No, I mean,
and if we're only talking about the fun memes, I'm not going to object to it. Okay, people can have it on the internet.
I mean, I think there's some of both. I've seen some. I mean, none of the guys and I'm friends with a bunch of the guys on all sides of this argument and movement. I really am. I've one of the best, I think, most measured is a guy named Kryptos. I mean, I know him in real life, but no doxing here. But I think he's been pretty thoughtful while still being on the definitely a rightist more than a conservative. And so I think part of the answer and I think part of the argument that some of these guys are making, Rich, is that the democratic arguments are over. That time has passed. We need to focus on what is right and wrong, and what is. I don't get the white identitarian thing. I understand the Christendom identitarian thing, which just happens on a Venn diagram to overlap a lot.
Right.
I get that. And maybe the idea is that, hey, Christendom is seen as, new crusade. That's not a winning deal. But all these guys are saying, and I have great sympathy for the argument that, that democracy as we've understood it, and for sure representative republicanism in a federated sense, is get close to done. It is great for an educated, virtuous people,
right?
And this goes back. You don't even have to be a Christian to understand these things. I mean, this is the Socratics. This is what they talked about, and it's interesting, in presuppositional and ecclesiocentric circles, we kind of have an aversion to the Socratics, but they had a lot of things to say that really line up with what, they were moving. I've kind of come to the conviction that Plato's, Socrates, to a lesser extent, Plato, and then certainly Aristotle were on the run for abandoning the pantheon and really understanding that that monotheism was the true way.
Well,
And
we
they
know that Plato read Moses. So,
and well, diakosune, the word for righteousness is all throughout Plato's works.
Hmm.
And he always understands that it has to be alien. It never comes from within.
Hmm.
And so, but they talk about these political philosophy issues of there's a lifespan, and you're either going to have monarchy, oligarchy, or democracy. And democracies, their understanding of good democracy was never expand the franchise as wide as you can possibly get it.
Right.
The way you hear the left say, hey, we need to make 16-year-olds vote, or maybe 14-year-olds.
Right.
And we need to make sure all immigrants, illegal or not, can vote, which is how it is.
Right.
I mean, oh, yeah, I'm a citizen. That's great. It's all in most states, even in Texas until this last election, all you had to do was just sign they had an affidavit there and you just signed it. Yeah, here's my address. Nobody ever checked that stuff.
Right.
So anyway, I think that and if you're a Christian, but even if you're not, there is, you have to have a view of what's best for everyone. And this kind of gets to my greater point, which of what we're talking about is just leave me alone movements never work.
Mm-hmm.
You have to have a vision for what is good and righteous
Mm-hmm.
and a government.
Yeah.
Because, hey, you do your own thing. I'm just going to be over here, unless you're Switzerland. And even then, we went in and completely took over their bank under W. We took over their banking system. Basically, they're just another puppet now. Just leave me alone movements never, ever work, for good or ill.
Sure.
So you have to have a vision for what is best for everyone. And that is hard for the humble Christian. Yet that was the view in Christendom.
Yeah.
Every nation saw themselves as being a blessed example through the king and through his court of an expression of God's rule on earth.
Mm-hmm.
well, if you want a society where you can be more or less left alone, you've got to fight for it. You have to create
Well,
that kind of society.
That's true politics.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
True politics isn't just arguing in a back room in a subcommittee over how we're going to tax the people.
Right.
True politics is, I have to fight against that which is other, who seeks the destruction of my way of life.
Which means you can't be shy about the pursuit of political power.
That's right.
You have to see political power as something that can be used for good or for ill, and it never goes away. So if you refuse to seek it, somebody else will, and then they will possess it. And so then what ends will they use it for? So that's always
that's right.
So yes, we need Christians who do not shy away from the pursuit of political power and political influence, and who I think are open about that there's a godly way to pursue this power. I mean, if Jesus is Lord of Lords and King of Kings, then certainly being a Lord or a king under Jesus would be a good thing. I think we have to be willing to say that.
What's the preamble of the Great Commission?
Yeah,
everybody forgets.
Yeah.
What's the basis?
Yeah.
Why on earth do I go and share this announcement of the New World Emperor? And that's what King of Kings means. Yeah. That's an ancient euphemism for the diadem, the emperor's diadem.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
If that's the basis for this Great Commission extended in love of the colonizing church, and it's where Wright, I know a lot of people, Wright says some goofy things, especially when he gets into some political issues and everything. But wow, does he bring an incisive mind to Scripture at times? He in his one of his first most impactful talks on Philippians, I believe it's Philippians, it might have been Colossians. He speaks of the purpose of the colonization of Rome colonizing wasn't to save people and bring them back to Rome.
Right, right.
The Rome was crowded and dirty. Obviously, heaven is not crowded any more crowded than it needs to be, or dirty, or anything. But he said the purpose of colonizing was to take Rome to the people.
Right. To take the blessings of Rome and extend them out.
Exactly.
Right.
And so that's Paul's understanding of the kingdom, is that we're not just trying to get escapists to go to heaven when they die. We're trying to remake the world, Lord's Prayer stuff. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And then when we die, we have this time of intermediate rest while we await our resurrection. And so that's where I'm kind of trying to go with this is I think our Christian politics has lost its savor largely in an eschatological doomerism, which is a result of a lot of the popularity of dispensationalism or functional dispensationalism.
Yeah.
But not only that, an emphasis on a disembodied heavenly experience rather than looking forward to a resurrection experience on this earth.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, that's really good. So, one piece of this that I see the dissident right discussing is obviously the racial piece, which ties in with immigration, fighting against anti-white racism. How do we do that? What does that look like? Another area, and I think, again, Trump probably really spurred this discussion on with his tariff strategy. And of course, now it's like he wants to, we've got tariff maxing going on, like let's just replace all taxes with the tariff, which the one thing I do appreciate that is that I think it recognizes that tariffs are a kind of tax.
Yeah.
But free markets. And so you've got the libertarian wing that really sees the free market as sort of the be all and end all. You've got others who would say, no, actually, there's a kind of if a nation is going to serve its own people and its own interests, that's going to, at least at times, override the freedom of the market and steer the market in a certain way. Like it's important that certain things get produced here. If all of our computer chips, say, come from another country and that country decides they no longer want to supply us, then what happens? Or our medicines are all imported. What happens if they decide to cut us off? Or all kinds of things that could go wrong with that. So
the reshoring movement.
So you've got the free market advocates, and you've got what I'll call the economic nationalism. That basically the freedom of markets has to be subordinated to the interests and ends of the nation.
Right.
You're in finance. How do you process those kind of debates?
Well, first of all, Adam Smith, who was not the only, but the first great writer on this topic. Sorry, my laptop is precarious. He assumed the Wealth of Nations assumed a Christendom. So that was the milieu of what he was writing into. In other words, there was the assumption of a common, if not exactly the same, a common in its basis set of presuppositions and faith.
And kind of a level playing field, therefore, where nations are going to deal justly with one another. That can be expected. Is that what
well, yeah, and just that an understanding that a nation's first loyalty was to its own citizens. Mm-hmm. And once you had that set, that there were certain natural advantages that each country has. For instance, Russia has a lot of titanium. We're probably, is it the question would be, does it make sense to incentivize local producers of titanium? There's a lot of titanium, I believe, in Western Tennessee. I believe that's right. I'm wrong on the details, but it's hard to get to. It's very expensive.
Right.
So does it make sense for us to, as a nation, incentivize going and getting that titanium from Western Tennessee, or to buy it much, much cheaper from Russia?
Right.
Well, that's a question of prudence. Okay. But do I pursue, would allowing for corporations to harm, for instance, and I'm a free market guy. I mean, I was member of the Ludwig von Mises Society for years, so that's where I'm coming from.
Yeah.
But back when it was more of a paleocon style of libertarianism. The new version, which is anarcho-capitalism, I really don't have any time for.
Yeah.
And I read Hans Hermann Hoppe was a hero. Democracy, the God that failed, is brilliant. I highly recommend it. Highly recommend it. But the question is, if we're going to have corporate personhood, which I'm honestly against, but if you're going to have that, then what do we demand from Rich Lusk and from Larson Hicks as persons, as citizens? We demand loyalty and obedience and all these other things. And so I think that's how you square that circle. If Apple, for instance, wants to have the rights of personhood through their corporate status, then then they owe first duty to their employees and their citizens who are here. And that is not anti-free market. That is just a legal understanding of the protections that are provided by a nation and the loyalty that is due to the citizens. Now, the great question, I can hear David Bahnsen saying, oh, you just want to keep candle makers employed once the light bulb comes out, right? And again, that's why you have to have godly, wise rulers.
Right.
The managerial impulse to Byzantine this away in a sea of regulations to where you never have an exception,
Right.
you never have to have sovereignty expressed and exercised is foolish.
Right.
It's a fool's game. It's like saying to a pastor, you never, ever once have to exercise prudence. And I mean, this is kind of the argument some say against the Book of Common Prayer, where everything's kind of laid out, what you're always going to do. I think that's silly, but that's kind of the theological example. You're always going to have to exert wisdom. You're always going to have exceptions where you're going to have to decide, do we cut the baby in half?
Right.
That legal
100%.
miracle. And I think where the libertarians have gotten in trouble is they've tried to envision a utopian system, just like the Marxists, that fixes every problem without the need for the sovereign.
Right.
You're always going to have the sovereign.
Well, I think the theme of
we're always ruled by men,
right,
never by a piece of paper. Even though the piece of paper, the Constitution, is important, and we say the same thing about the church. A church constitution matters, but it's the elders who rule the church, and it would be better to have wise elders with a poor constitution than a perfect constitution with foolish elders.
100%. And I love my Bible only because it reveals the mind of God, the personhood of God, not because there's that actual ink and those particular papers are somehow holy. It reveals the very mind of God. I know God through His Word. So ultimately, you're going to be ruled by men.
I think one of the themes that we're talking about here.
So Ron, just to kind of.
Sorry.
Go ahead, Leslie.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I was just going to say, I think one of the themes we're talking about here that's come up a lot before we started recording and since is the idea of maturity and the movement of the gospel, in society is a movement towards, from immaturity to maturity, and the problems we see with the people who are going off the deep end with Stephen Wolf stuff or fill in the blank. There's all manner of different ditches that people are finding themselves in. It's not a matter of this guy is completely wrong or a system's completely flawed, as much as it is about Christians who want a paper pope, who want a system to latch on to, so that they don't have to exercise wisdom anymore. I'm reminded of I feel like this if you're playing the got a minute drinking game, this is probably one that comes up a lot. But Nassim Taleb's one of my favorite quotes of his is he says at a national level he's a libertarian, at a state level, he's a Republican. At a local level, he's a Democrat, and at a church and family level, he's a communist. And I feel like it's a great example. It's a great way to demonstrate the idea that these ideas work at different scales. There's maturity involved in knowing
Yes.
when and where and how to apply these different ideas. And that's something I just don't see right now
Right.
in a lot of this internet conversation about these political topics is a maturity, or a willingness to kind of do the work, to think carefully about anything.
A lot of, not all, but a lot of the movement tends to come from the heavily, what I call hyper systematized scholastic, reform scholastic side of things.
Yeah.
And some from the kind of Melanchthon Lutheran,
Mm-hmm.
kind of that side. And there is a temptation. I got to be in trouble because I love the Westminster Confession of Faith. It's fantastic. It was a political document. It was chartered by Parliament at a specific time.
Yeah.
It is not the answer to every question.
Right.
Even in its great wisdom, it's amazing. Love it. The catechisms are great. Taught my kids they had to memorize the first somewhat questions in the children's catechism, which is wonderful. But you can't flow chart every problem.
Right.
And that's always man's. I just think about it like this way. At home, contingencies drive me crazy. We had a leak in the drain pan from our downstairs air conditioning unit. The drain pan got clogged, and we had a leak, and it brought down part of the ceiling in my kitchen.
Yeah.
And I just was like, this is just supposed to work forever.
Right.
Well, it's not that big a deal. I cleaned out the pipe, stuck a fail switch. If the pan drips here, once we're sure it's completely dried out, we'll replaster, and no one will ever know the difference.
Right.
But we have this desire to make what was it? It's kind of like modern version of alchemy, the perpetual motion machine.
Yeah.
That never needs any human input. And that is, it's just not going to happen.
Yeah.
I don't think God really wants, I don't think that's the telos God wants us pursuing. I think he's searching for worshipers.
Right. And I also always think about the fact that Scripture says that we are going to judge angels. That we human beings are going to judge angels.
Yes.
And it's like, what has to happen to me between now and then, for me to be competent, for that work. Right. I mean, there's a lot of development and maturity that's going to have to happen. Yeah. Right.
Right. And so, and I mean, makes that strange promise about ruling many cities, that it's one of those verses we just kind of, I don't know what that's about, so you just kind of go, and
one thing it's about is the goodness of rule and the
right.
goodness of power. I mean, that's part of it, is that we're made for dominion. And this is where my interest,
that's good, Rich,
say federal vision, so-called, and political theology, and even a lot of the masculinity discussion that's taking place kind of all converge, is when you come to a passage like Romans chapter 2. And Paul says, that life is basically about seeking glory, honor, and immortality. Mm-hmm. There's a certain kind of reformed person that sees that as hypothetical. Like, oh, this is a work salvation. This is the covenant of works. That's, but nobody can do that. No, I think the federal vision interpretation, exegesis of that text, and later in the passage when Paul talks about a justification for doers of the law at the last day, I think pursuing glory and honor and immortality is exactly what we are supposed to be doing. That is a way of describing what the Christian life is. And those are things that ought to appeal to us. And if we say, no, that would be works, then what we're doing is creating a view of the Christian life and Christian engagement with the world that is passive, that lacks all ambition and drive towards dominion,
Right.
that's really
Yes.
emasculated. I mean, that's where the masculinity
Right.
comes in. So it's one of those
Rich,
passages where I'm like, this is what we need: Christian men who understand their calling to pursue glory, honor, and immortality. That's what we should be about. But if you talk about that, people are going to think that either sounds really prideful or that sounds like works. And I want to say, no, that's actually what God made us for.
where do you think, and what impact do you have? Maybe it's just among us, Theocell guys, that it's had an impact. But where do you think, like, the Westminster West kind of neo-Lutheran, that's all theology of glory, Rich. That's
Right.
not the theology of the cross. Where I find that I find the dealing with those passages that obviously are calling humanity to mature and exercise dominion and rule. I find the Westminster West hyper R2K,
Yes,
whatever you call them.
Yeah.
I find it incredibly unsatisfying.
Yeah, so
Nice.
here's where those things line up on the other side, and so they would say that's a theology of glory, not a theology of the cross. And I would say, well, we are supposed to pursue glory. Sin is falling short of the glory of God. If you don't sin, you will hit the target of glory every time. So
That'll preach.
So R2K, the radical two kingdom guys, they don't want to see Jesus honored in public. They want pluralism. And they would say that's what our First Amendment, that's what it requires, is pluralism. I think that's terrible.
That seems to place the Bible underneath the Bill of Rights.
Well, it does in a way, and I would say their wrong interpretation even of the Bill of Rights, which doesn't necessitate a kind of public pluralism. But
because that was written when a lot of states had a
a
Christian profession for holding office.
Exactly. I mean, that's one thing that I think a lot of today's classical liberals don't understand, is that by their standards, classical liberalism is very illiberal, because classical liberalism, and it's early, like if you sort of identify the American Constitution with classical liberalism, which I think is what a lot of people do, and I think you can make a pretty good case for that. There were sexual crimes on the books of every state. So say sodomy was criminalized everywhere. Thomas Jefferson had some very clear things to say about the criminalization of sodomy for the good of society. There were religious tests for holding office, not at the federal level, but at the state level. So if you wanted to engage in politics at the state level and you were an atheist, you're not going to be able to do it. You were not even allowed to get a loan, you say, to borrow money up until the early part of the 20th century without some kind of church or synagogue membership in most places in the U.S. So what we think of as classical liberalism was not a free-for-all. I love your analogy of biblical liberty is like baseball liberty.
Yeah,
it means you play the game according to the rules, and that's liberty. If you do away with the rules, you can't play the game anymore.
Right.
So
just a
true
bunch of
liberty is
angry
always
white
an
guys
ordered
with
liberty
bats.
to do. Yeah, you just have angry guys with bats. That's right. So it's always
Dominican
liberty
guys.
that is ordered and structured in a certain way.
Well,
When
Rich,
Paul talks about us being set free in Galatians, it's for freedom that you have been set free. That freedom is not autonomy. That freedom is to live according to our creational design and our redemptive purpose. It's to live according to the Word of God. That's true. Psalm 119, I walk about in liberty because I keep your law. That's true liberty. And so classical liberalism, detached from a moral framework, which is really what we're seeing now, detached from a moral framework that can guide us and that can give us a shared end, a shared goal, is an absolute disaster. So one way to think about all of this is that in America's, or certainly in colonial America, but I think even in the early days after our present Constitution was adopted, America very much understood itself within the Christendom meta-narrative. So the overarching story is America is one more nation that will take her place among the Christian nations of the world.
Yes.
But what has happened is that narrative got hijacked by another story. And it's the story of individual autonomy. And so when guys like Patrick Deneen argue against classical liberalism, they say, well, it's all about individual autonomy. And that's why well, of course, if it was about individual autonomy, that's a huge problem. That's not what it was. I do think that's what it has become. And so now, and Christopher Caldwell even talks about, how we've really existed under several different constitutions, and the Civil Rights Amendment is sort of the late. And I think that's
like
exactly
the French,
right. And that's
like
how it
the
got
different
hijacked.
French republics. Yeah.
Yeah. So that Christendom meta narrative gets hijacked by the personal autonomy narrative. And so under the Christendom meta narrative, there is a common end. America exists for the glory of God. America is to be a Christian nation, a disciple nation.
Right.
And we want to, if we're going to export anything, it's going to be missionaries. Later in our history, and again, this doesn't happen all at once, but I think it especially begins to crystallize with the civil rights movement, which was a mix of some things that were necessary, but also some really bad things mixed into that. It becomes all about personal autonomy. And now, what kind of oppressed groups can we liberate? Who's been oppressed by nature or by tradition or by the Christian faith that needs to be liberated? And so, because you ask the question, how did we get from a nation that required oaths, like a religious test oath to hold office at the state level, to now it's a crime if you break too hard on the rainbow flag that's been painted on the street in your town? Okay, how did we go from that to that? Well, we've changed stories. We jumped the tracks at some point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, and and I think we've got to understand that. So part of what this is doing is, we do want to recover that story that governed and guided America earlier on in our history.
The libertarians. I married into a Canadian family. My wife is naturalized citizen, but she's from Canada, and so I had to learn to love hockey, and I enjoy watching it. But here's at any one time, here's 12 guys on the ice with incredibly sharp sticks and deadly sharp blades.
Yeah.
Who are running into each other way faster than in any NFL game or college football game, and who get mad and angry. Yet, maybe once in the history of American pro hockey has there been a death due to, or a serious injury due to something that has been done violently.
Yeah.
In other words, these are people who submit to rule.
There's a code.
Yeah.
There is a code. There is an alien righteousness. There is a standard that is imposed from outside. And that is reality. And sometimes, again, I think the libertarian impulse, and again, I swam in these waters, is how do we create a paper God?
Yeah.
How do we create to where I'm not under anyone else? Or how can I even be not under anything?
Yeah.
Well, the current libertarian view, the problem with it is that there's no moral framework.
Right.
So a kind of libertarianism combined with a moral framework could be good, because it would maximize.
That wouldn't be called libertarian.
To play the game.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
I mean, obviously, you can put too many rules on the game, and that makes it impossible to play too. So, I mean, libertarians understand that. You don't want to have too many rules.
No.
But you've got to have some rules. So that's the key thing.
So I'm concerned about the. I think libertarian and anarcho-libertarianism is one ditch. I think the other ditch that I'm seeing is today that's emerging, and I think it's emerged out of this kind of Stephen Wolfe, Christian nationalism kind of scene is the complete opposite in the spectrum. This desire for a Christian fascist, like a Christian dictator, who's going to a strong Christian, political force that's going to save America. And I don't. What do we say to those guys? That are disenfranchised about capitalism, about the Constitution, about democracy. What's the answer for those guys, or what's the telos that we're trying to, the vision we're trying to cast for these guys?
Well, I think those are. I think that's not one specific movement. I think
Yeah.
you've got a bit of a conflation of different. There is absolutely a rise in uh, not just reading Nietzsche for the for the intellectual understanding of the criticisms of applied
Hmm.
German idealism and how it was tearing down Christendom
Right.
from within
Right.
in the mid to late 1800s,
Yeah.
but who actually are buying the stuff.
Yeah. They want a Huberman.
And this promise of the overman, you see it it's the vitalism movement, and that's just what it is not Christian. Now there's a bunch of guys who are too immature to see the true antipathy there.
Hmm.
So, but that's 20 something. I mean, like, who's the 20 something guy who drives me crazy, who I've got no time for, but he carries a huge stick on the right. Nick Fuentes.
Yeah.
Just immature
Yeah.
and wrong. But what's driving that is kind of this vitalist, and it's ultimately nihilist. I mean, not to get off on uh, uh, philosophy for a minute, but Nietzsche ultimately was exploring the idea of from Xenophon. I lose track of the Socratic. I mean of the Stoic idea of eternal return. And if you've ever watched True Detective, the first season, it's what Cole was talking about. Time is a flat circle, and everything we are doing now, we're just going to relive and relive and relive. And Strauss, for instance, was enamored with this idea, this eternal return idea, and it really captured a lot of the atheistic Jewish thought in the philosophical thought in the mid deal. But so there's that, okay, for the guys who are really getting into that. Now, do I think that the average guy who's dabbling with racism is reading a ton of Nietzsche? Probably not. That's pretty dense stuff. But there is that out there among the influencers.
Yeah.
But that's a separate thing, I think, from the and then Gottfried wrote a great book on fascism, and he makes the argument, which I actually agree with, that fascism that we understood as fascism, especially as nothing outside the state, everything for the state, everything in the state, the Mussolini understanding, which is kind of complete and distilled fascism, was at a certain time in a certain place and really can't happen again. Now, could there be, as that's understood? And I think I would highly recommend Paul Gottfried's book on fascism for that. Now, to what you're talking about, which is more of a strong man or power centralized in a single person. What Michael Anton has written about in Red and Blue Caesar, Red and his writings on Red and Blue Caesar that he did, I believe, for the Claremont Institute. And Michael's very, very smart guy, fantastic writer. And I would argue that we already had Blue Caesar, and that was FDR. Just go read FDR's first inaugural address. FDR assumed power. It was an imperial presidency. He absolutely had the courts and the Congress in the palm of his hands, doing everything he wanted to, up until the last 6 months or so of his life. Do we have a Red Caesar? Well, the arguments there are we done? Is America capable of sustaining a representative republic? A democracy, is democracy scalable to the cultural, geographic, and population diversity that we have now that is not virtuous? And I think there's good arguments to be made that no, it's not. So you're going to have some type of transition. Is it wise to call for that? That's a good question. I've actually written that this is the whole accelerationism deal.
Yeah.
Nick Land has written a ton about this. Nick, very smart guy, was dabbling with Christianity for a while. He follows me on Twitter, and I'm not a very big account. So But he was writing on this, and so a lot of guys have taken up. Well, we need this acceleration because what we have now is so bad,
Yeah.
and so we have this movement through a tough time, and I push back against that, not because I don't know whether it's coming or not, but I just know a lot of good people needlessly die anytime you go what Eric Prince calls off script. So Eric Prince has written a lot that's very good on this. Eric's a faithful Catholic. He was in our offices not too long ago. Very thoughtful guy on these things. He ran Blackwater. He understands power. Michael Anton has written on this. Paul Gottfried has written on this. And these are guys who are very thoughtful, balanced, mature people. And I think people ought to read these guys and really interact with their thought, with their Bible in one hand, and figure these things out for themselves. I sure don't have all the answers. I don't know what tomorrow brings. I know the path we're on I'm pretty convinced is unsustainable. I think doing democracy hard, let's just do it harder, isn't going to work.
Yeah. We were not founded as a democracy anyway.
Well, Jesus is a king, so I don't have a problem with monarchy. I just know that it's very, very messy when it goes bad. But look around. This thing is pretty messy, going bad too.
Larson, to your question about a strong man, I was actually just teaching on Judges chapter 9 last night at a Bible study. And so this is in the aftermath of Gideon's death. His son Abimelech comes and says to the people of Shechem, would it be better for the 70 sons of Gideon to rule over you or for me to rule over you? So basically offers to them to centralize power. You can have 70 rulers, very decentralized, or you can have one, and they choose the strong man, and it is an absolute disaster. Now, what I find interesting is that, Jotham, so the first thing Abimelech does is kill all of Gideon's other sons because they would be political rivals, even though there's no indication that any of them were seeking a similar kind of centralization of power. He still kills them as rivals, but one escapes, Jotham, and then Jotham tells a parable where the trees want a king. And so the trees go to the fig tree, and the trees go to the olive tree, and the trees go to the grapevine and say, will you rule over us? And in each case, these trees say, no, we're just going to continue to be productive and fruitful and do what we do to fulfill the dominion mandate, basically, what God made us to do. That's what we enjoy doing. And he talks about the bramble. They go to the bramble, and the bramble says, yes, I'll provide shade for you, which of course is a lie, like all politicians lie. Brambles don't produce shade. And then threatens them that fire will come out from the bramble and destroy them if they don't basically give him his way. And Jotham says, this is what's going to happen to you. You've chosen the bramble to rule over you. Fire is going to come out and destroy you. He says, this is a curse. Fire will come out from you to destroy him, and fire will come out from him to destroy you. Basically, you're wicked, and the king you chose is wicked, and so you're going to destroy one another. And revolution always breeds revolution. And so Abimelech has acted in a revolutionary way. It's kind of like the French Revolution. You got this revolution. And I always feel sorry for French kids who have to memorize all the details of the aftermath of the French Revolution, because it's this constant churn of power and reorganization. And they're basically trying to start history over. And it's just lots of death. It's like all the people killed in the guillotine. And you have this constant churn of rulers and different ways they're organizing themselves because there's no stability to it. There's nothing that grounds any of it until you get the dictator, until you get the tyrant who steps in and says the system's failing, what you need is a strong man. Well, that's what Abimelech has tried to be, but revolution breeds revolution. And so you get an uprising on the part of some men. They go to war with Abimelech. Abimelech actually defeats them, but he's not content with that, and he goes to Thebez, which is this now Jewish city. Shechem is largely Canaanite. He goes to Thebez. It's like he wants to expand his power. And that's where he ends up getting the woman drops the millstone on his head and crushes him. And one thing that I think comes out of a story like that is that, yes, beware of strong men, okay? That kind of strong man. But another thing you see is that God will turn the wicked against each other. There's a kind of mutually assured destruction amongst the wicked. And I think you see that there. And it's interesting. In 2 Timothy chapter 3, Paul talks about what will characterize the last days. And whether you take the last days as the whole interadvental period or the last days of human history, or my preference would be the last days of the Old Covenant, he describes these people. He says they're lovers of self, of money, they're proud and arrogant, they're abusive, they disobey their parents, they're ungrateful. Lists all of these sins. They lack self-control, they do not love what is good, they're lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God. I mean, actually, whatever time period you think he's talking about, you certainly see how he could have, all these things would apply to our society. This is what people are like. And then Paul says, such people will not make much progress. Okay. What do the wicked call themselves in our day? They call themselves progressives.
Yes.
The people who live for their own pleasure, they call themselves progressive. But Paul says they will not make very much progress.
Right.
Okay. It's a dead end. Rebelling against God and rejecting God's ways is always a dead end. You can call yourselves progressives and you can say you're on the right side of history, but really you're always in your last days if you live like that.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something I think we need to encourage our people with. Evil self-destructs. Evil always turns against itself. And I think that's something that we are seeing even in our own day, is how the wicked can turn against each other and destroy themselves. The question, I think, is, will the righteous be ready to pick up the pieces and build something new and better when that happens? And that's what we've got to be preparing ourselves for. Like, if you're asking for a way forward, humanly speaking, I don't think there's a way forward. And that's why I tend to say there's not a political solution. Obviously, politics is going to be part of the solution when it happens, but I don't think politics is the solution. And another reason I say that is just because the kind of ruler we need, or the kind of rulers, plural, that we need, where are you going to find it? I can't go out to my backyard and pick a godly, faithful congressman off of the tree that's growing them in my backyard. Men like that have to be formed. Yeah. And they're going to be formed by the church and in the context of faithful families and in the context of a faithful and mature church. And so that, to me, that's the leading edge. That's always going to be the tip of the spear.
How does this, I think we need to be aware of how this tends to work in history, is that when you get civilizational decline, as we as Christians would understand it, then eventually you do usually get a Charlemagne or a
Napoleon
or Napoleon
or a Mussolini
or a Franco
or a Hitler
or a Mussolini, and the decks are shuffled and everything gets reset and we start to play a new game. Because that is it's Judges. Judges isn't just historically and literally true. It is a typological lesson on life, on political life across generations. And I think that, I don't always agree with Mearsheimer's, y'all know John Mearsheimer, geopolitical realist, recommended. You won't always agree with him. I sure don't. But his idea is, well, history is what history is. And so you have to deal with reality. And the church, again, through the office of the prophet, it needs to be the reminding the leaders, its people, of here's not only reality, but a vision for a better future. What the details of that are, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know what,
Yeah.
I know what, I just think we need to be wise as serpents and know here's what generally happens when decadent people try to rule themselves in decadence, and who try to remove themselves from all.
Yeah.
Well, there are several factors here. One is, I don't think that America has an equal on the global stage. People can talk about China and Russia all they want. They're not equal to America. America will fall from within, as most great empires throughout history have. Most likely that's how it will happen. I think right now that's already really what's happening. That's not to say we can't reverse course. I actually think some kind of conservative backlash is coming. Now, will it be, how Christian will that conservative backlash be? I think that's an open question. I'm not sure that the irreligious right is going to be a whole lot better than the irreligious left. If it's not tethered to to anything. So I'm hopeful that the conservative backlash will be very much grounded or influenced by the Christian faith, but I think that that's an open question. How much will it be? But there's no question the path we're on right now is not sustainable. Things can't go on like this forever. That's true economically. You can't keep printing money out of nothing indefinitely. No. That's true morally. You can't keep making up new sexualities as you go and hoping that things still work out. It's true in all, you can't keep doing diversity kind of stuff and have companies and goods and services that have any level of quality. So there's all kinds of ways in which what we're doing is not sustainable. Right. The question is, how do you get back on track? And obviously, this is something that ultimately only God can do. Maybe God sends us widespread revival and reformation through his church. Maybe God does give us a Christian Franco, although I think it's more likely to be a non-Christian, Abimelech or something worse.
I think that's absolutely true. I think if you get a strong man, a stronger type, which I think is ultimately somewhat inevitable, just for the sake of, in the sense of there being some type of reset at some point. Not saying it's good. I just think that it's probably inevitable. That I think the Christian desire. This is just my opinion. I'd be open to disagreement, but I really find the renewed federalism as the Christian, that the church and governments and righteousness is best done the more smaller and local. And the nation was conceived really where men were the citizens of the states and the states were citizens of the union.
Right.
And that's the political theory.
Right.
And I think a renewed, a vastly reduced federal workforce, if Schedule F is the answer to that, I don't know. I think it's a step in the right direction.
Yeah.
But renewed federalism, you're either going to need federalism or some form of, it's either going to go one way or the other. I think as Christians, we would much rather have federalism than nationwide establishment.
Yeah.
Because that nationwide establishment on the current path would be just enforced female priest wokeness.
Right.
And yeah. We're going to invoke Lomez. He's been that's an interesting, the whole doxing thing has cracked me up, because every time they go and dox one of these guys, whether we would agree with everything he says or not, I mean, some good-looking family guy who's very well read, and I mean, it was crazy. They doxed Lomez, and that was kind of the biggest own goal on the left. And they did it again 2 or 3 days ago to somebody, and they showed his picture, and this guy's like, somebody what does he have to say? Some good-looking dude who has a family and loves his wife, and I'm like,
yeah, that's so funny. Well,
Ron, I got a couple more questions for you. I know we need to wrap this up. You've described yourself as a soft ecclesiocentrist. I would use a similar kind of terminology probably to describe my own views.
Yeah,
there are different varieties of ecclesiocentrism, but we certainly see the church as central to what God is doing in history, and the church is central to any culture in which the church is placed. But what do you see as the role of the church in this? We've touched on that a little bit, but maybe just kind of tie up some loose ends there for us.
Well, the most compelling book I've ever read on it, which isn't really written to this, is Against Christianity by Peter Leithart.
Yeah.
I can't talk about it without tearing up.
Oh,
I mean, and that's a Constantinian book. Mm-hmm. But what I think my version of soft ecclesiocentrism is the church is the center of hope and life for the believer, and the wellspring of truth for the state. In other words, what if we're going to bear the sword? What is the difference between good and evil that we're going to bear it upon?
Right.
The limits of my where I would say ecclesiocentrism has a limit is realizing that it was King David, not the high priest, not a prophet, who reorganized the priesthood. Jesus is, when in the Great Commission, he is on a throne he is both high priest and king, but that is an office of one. And so I understand that the state alone bears the sword.
Mm-hmm.
And so my ecclesiocentrism is, and it would be federal in the sense that I have not a real problem with some version of establishment,
Mm-hmm.
but it would be a hyper federalized establishment with room for nonconformity. But so I see the church as the center of faith and truth, but understanding the family and the state are part of a three-legged stool. It's
Yeah.
just as this one leg goes history.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, so the church should not usurp the roles of
Right.
the state or the family, but the church does have a role in discipling them.
It's
talked
a,
about
it's
I think
ecclesiocentrism.
I actually
not-
like the
Yeah.
I actually like the way the
Oh, sorry, I was going
I
to say
like the
it's-
way that the Orthodox understand. Sorry, go ahead, Larson.
Sorry, Ron. I think we just have a delay. It's all good. I was just saying it's ecclesiocentrism, not an ecclesiocracy.
Right. No, absolutely, and I think the world needs to hear that ecclesiocentrism, that the centrality of God's special revelation and his colonizing force in the church is not ecclesiocracy. It absolutely is not. That God ordained the state to accomplish purposes that would be corrupting if they were brought into the church.
Yeah.
And the church is not the family.
It's the ring of power.
So when we talk about the church as family or the church as nation, so for example, Peter says you're a royal priesthood, a holy nation.
Absolutely.
The church. Or when Paul talks about the church as the household of God, the family of God, that does not mean that the church overtakes those other spheres. It just means the church in some way provides a model for those other spheres, or as a guide for those other spheres in some kind of way. They each have their own jurisdiction. They each have their own domain. They each have their own tool. We talked about the family with the rod and the state with the sword and the church with the keys.
Yes.
Sphere sovereignty, I think, fits into this. But I think the problem with the classical sphere sovereignty model, like of Kuyper, is it kind of has this flattening effect.
It does.
Jesus is Lord over all the spheres, but then no spheres are distinguished as more, with one being more central than the other. Whereas I would want to say a sort of modified sphere sovereignty. The church is it has a kind of centrality that no other sphere has.
Because it holds the truth.
Because it holds the truth, and it's where life comes from. So, like in Psalm 128,
Yes.
which is about the family, at the end of starts off with the blessed man, and this is what his family's like. But at the end of it, you find that the blessing comes out of Zion.
Yes.
So where does the blessed man find his blessedness? It's in the gathering of God's people where the word and sacrament are present.
Right.
Yeah.
And when you come to church, you come to the heavenly Zion.
Yeah. Yeah. And we go to church to meet the king. I mean, it's this God is expecting us in our maturity to be able to think about these things on multiple dimensions. You go and meet your high priest, but he's enthroned as a king when you go and meet him. Mount Zion was higher than Mount Moriah, still is, I guess. And yet again, it's where we miss the role. I think so much, not enough ink has been spilled on the role of the prophet, who is the emissary that goes to the king and reminds him, go and make a copy of the book. This is what is right. These are the people whom you serve.
Yeah.
Your kingship is for these people. You are to protect them. You are their champion. Jesus is at the front he's riding the horse.
Yeah.
Bridle deep in blood. So it's very hard for the immature to have these multi-ordered hierarchies, but that's what we're called to understand in maturity and be able to go, oh yeah, the church that's where I go and I receive the tree of life. That's where I receive the truth. It is from this where the fountain, the water that keeps me from ever thirsting comes from. Yet there are these other institutions. I mean, we see throughout history that the three institutions do battle with each other for first loyalty.
Right.
You know, the church and state have often battled who has the first loyalty of the family. The father often in a hyper patriarchal. I have a lot of sympathy for patriarchy, but it can be way overdone
Yeah.
to where it does
Absolutely.
battle with, and we are to have multiple loyalties as a believer, understanding that in the eschaton it is all rolled up into Christ.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it all coalesces into Christ in
Yes.
the end. And so any of those institutions, including the church, can become a rival to Christ.
Yes,
If they depart
sure
from His
can.
word. Absolutely.
We see it all around us.
Ron, I appreciate this really, just so much of what you said has been really, really helpful. And you have mentioned a lot of books, a lot of people to read along the way. One thing I appreciate about you too is that you've got friends on different sides of a lot of these issues we've talked about. You've got friends to the right. You've got other friends who are maybe not as far right as you are. You're well connected in that way, and you're certainly well read. And you do, of course, a lot of writing for American Reformer and perhaps elsewhere. Tell us so for our listeners who may be new to a lot of these discussions or who are not as active on social media, who are some good people to follow, whether it's on Twitter or elsewhere? What are some good websites like American Reformer? What are some books that people should be familiar with or articles?
Well, I would go right now and get a copy of Through New Eyes by James Jordan. If you haven't read it, read it and enjoy. It had as big an impact on me as Mere Christianity did when I first read it.
Mm-hmm.
And go to the old Biblical Horizons. If you love 90s web architecture, you'll love Biblical Horizons. But a wellspring,
Yeah.
I mean, article after article.
Great stuff.
The case against Western civilization, even though I disagree with Jim on a lot of the conclusions, is brilliant. It is absolutely brilliant. Just one of the greatest Christian minds,
Mm-hmm.
on par with anyone you could mention. So and then I would read. I love Against Christianity. I think Peter's neo-Constantinianism. He's kind of softened on that, but I like old Peter. But he's brilliant in that book, and there are so many parables. The parable of the Canadian who thinks he's an American has stuck with me forever.
Mm-hmm.
That Barrett recounted in his famous 2002 lecture. So those are two books. But then again, the works of Paul Gottfried are brilliant. Jewish guy, but I think Paul's kind of inching towards us.
Nice.
Just between you, me, and the viewers of this pod. I really do. Pray for him.
That's awesome.
Brilliant writer, but his works on fascism,
Okay.
brilliant. I would read Michael Anton's essays. I think are really, from a philosophical standpoint, Michael is a kind of a lapsed Catholic, but that the things of God are in his bones, so to speak. But he's very well connected, very well thought out. So on those things, I would suggest reading him. As far as online, I write for American Reformer. I think there's it's run by friends of mine who love the Lord Jesus, love this nation, and love His church. It is a collaboration of both Reformed Presbyterians and Reformed Baptists.
Mm-hmm.
I was baptized as a Baptist. I'm a deacon in the PCA, but I had to accept John Calvin into my heart. But I have a love for the Baptist church simply because our country is majority evangelical. The evangelicals are majority Baptist or of that structure, and we should pray for them. So I like American Reformer. I really like I enjoy the book reviews of Charles Haywood. He's an acquired taste, but he's a dear friend, and I love him, and an absolute brilliant mind. Whether you agree or disagree with him, I think you'd enjoy it on a variety of topics. The guy is a voracious reader. He writes at theworthyhouse.com. If you want to get well read without truly being well read, that's a great resource. And then I would not be afraid of reading things that are difficult and tough. Carl Schmitt was somebody who we would have vast disagreements with, but if you read a very unread book, The Nomos of the Earth, he proclaims his faithfulness to Christ and his church, and was against Hitler, yet worked within that power structure, but was brilliant on it. Really brought the modern understanding of political theology to the fore, that politics, our understanding of politics is really how we understand God brought into the secular realm. So these are all things that take maturity, and your maturity is only going to come from the Spirit and spending time in the Word and the church. So do those things first. And then explore. God is sovereign over all these things. And before you read any of it, give thanks to Him for the mind that can understand these things.
Yeah.
So that's my encouragement.
Yeah, that's really good.
It's awesome.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you for your
You
time
bet.
and your insight.
It's been a real pleasure. Love you guys and appreciate your work for the church.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ron.
Likewise.
Well, Rich, it's been another minute. Appreciate the time you both have given us, and look forward to. We'll have to have you back on, Ron. It sounds like there's a lot more we could probably get into, and this has been a lot of fun for us.
That's true.
Yeah. Cool.
I would love it.
Awesome. Well, hey, have a great day, you
Thanks a lot,
guys, and we'll see you next time.
The God a Minute podcast is a ministry of Trinity Reformed Church in Huntsville, Alabama. If you like this podcast, you might enjoy one of our other podcasts, The Good Life Podcast, featuring Matt Carpenter interviewing experts in their field about how their work contributes to the good life.